I'm Natalia Lopez, lead librarian for data instruction at NC State Libraries. And I'm joined by my colleague today, Claire Cahoon, who is a digital pedagogy and scholarship specialist at Bucknell University Library and IT. So what are we doing today? So really our focus today is to discuss best practices for when you're designing data visualizations and thinking about how to effectively tell a story. So a lot of us are sort of accustomed to having sort of lots of data that we're collecting, both assessment data, maybe programming data, sort of enrollment data. We're oftentimes sort of tasked on our teams to find ways to tell stories so that we can either make decisions or compel some sort of change, right? So whether we're requesting more resources, more funding, oftentimes to our supervisors, to our teammates, perhaps to funders or elected officials. Data visualization is a really sort of critical way that we can kind of illustrate a point, right? So illustrate some sort of need from our community and support that, right? And so in this session, we're really going to focus on how to think about design principles carefully and help ensure that that story, that really important message that we're often trying to craft, is coming across as effectively as possible. For a lot of us, we know this, we have busy lives. It's really, we often have a lot of information that we're sort of reviewing or sort of needing to take in all the time. And as we know, sort of data visualization can oftentimes really take a lot of information and sort of be able to deliver that information rather quickly. So specifically, we're going to cover the importance of focusing our data. So how to really tell the story with the right data points, how to choose chart types, and how to use color, type, and text to help you craft a story. And we're going to be sharing some free online resources along the way, as well as some tips that we think you can sort of integrate into your process relatively quickly. For reference, all of these slides can be accessed at this link, go.ncsu.edu/data-story, and Claire will check that in. As you heard, this will be recorded as well, and these slides will be emailed to you. But just in case you want to refer to them throughout the session. And before we really get started, Claire and I really want to acknowledge that this session today is an adapted version of a very popular workshop session that we deliver quite frequently at NC State Libraries called The Elements of Visualization Design. That session has been developed and continuously adapted over the years by a number of NC State Library staff. So we really want to just thank and acknowledge the time and effort that has been collectively put into this session. It's a really great session, I think, and really important for us to understand how to effectively tell stories. So, okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So what you're going to see in the slides today is what we describe as a summary table. It's a table with data. This is fictitious data that we created for this session, and it lists a series of workshops and attendance based on university status. Right, so we're having a fictitious data set of a library workshop series and sort of creating some attendance. And so university status just refers to sort of number of undergrads versus faculty versus staff versus graduate students. And so you yourself may work with a different population. You may have a different type of data set. Maybe you're thinking about age ranges or what counties are represented in your programming. For today, we're going to focus on sort of this case use for the purposes of this session. So let's say we're part of a team that's designing a new workshop series, and we really want to hone in on sort of our undergraduate students. We want to think about their needs and sort of what sort of information we have from a previous semester, and think about like what they've been drawn to. And so that's going to help guide us in making some decisions about what to offer the following semester. And so Claire and I have generated a quick graph just to share out with our team, right? So we want to just kind of get started and sort of see what we find. So here you're going to see our very quick, snazzy graph that we generated using Google Sheets. And just for in terms of resources as well. So Google Sheets is sort of the Google version of spreadsheets. You may be more comfortable using Excel. We offer quite a lot of instruction on Google Sheets. It's a pretty user-friendly tool to create some charts and graphs. Oftentimes sort of the analyzing the data and sort of putting it together in a way requires a little bit of tutorials and sort of learning. So I will give you a heads up about that. But once you actually are building the visualization, the sort of user interface is actually pretty friendly. So we do encourage the use of that if it's of interest. But so this is what we sort of came up with before we started really thinking about our best design principles, right? And so what we're going to ask you is to take a look at this graph and think about this question. What are the top 3 workshops that undergraduates attended? And so take a couple of seconds and take a look at it. And then go ahead and take this poll, and Claire will send this link. If for whatever reason you can't access the poll, feel free to chat in your response. And we will give you a little heads up. It's okay if this is challenging to figure out. This isn't the easiest graph to interpret quickly. And really, we're going to spend the rest of the session sort of talking about why. Just give you all. Oops, sorry. Okay. Just a couple more seconds. Kind of preview. So it looks like we're doing pretty good, right? Those are the top 3, I will say. And remember, I will come back to this graph actually later on when we're talking about color. This happens to be a very relevant example. Okay. Thank you. So as we sort of people wrap up, it looks like everyone was able to get the top 3. We do have a good amount of people who kind of couldn't tell. And so I want to sort of go back to our presentation, and I want to flip over to this redesign, right? And so it's the exact same data being represented. It's just being represented in a different way, right? And so if you can take a minute and sort of chat in, can you share one noticeable difference that you might notice between this chart and the last chart that you think might be helping sort of with understanding? So we can see the full wording organized by size of group. It's not a stacked bar. There's lots of things in here, focusing on one data point. Other populations are excluded. Limited color palette. Yep. All of these are great. And like everyone's got some really great responses. So yeah, exactly. And so really in the session, we're going to talk about each of these elements and sort of talk about why they're particularly effective, right? And so Claire is actually going to get us started and begin to break down sort of what this chart is doing and why it's a little more effective than the previous chart. So go for it, Claire.
Before you go on, Natalia, we did have a question in the chat. Can we see both charts at once? I don't think we have a slide with that, but would you mind just flipping back to the previous chart?
Sure.
Maybe we can just show both one more time.
Yeah. So we'll see, this is a 3D stacked bar chart. You have all the different populations. You have the axes over on the horizontal, so x-axes. You have categories labeled. You have a few different colors, right? So those are a couple things that differentiate it. This, on the other hand, is a horizontal bar chart. We've limited the colors. We've also focused in on just undergraduates. We flipped the axes, but so we'll keep talking about this, but just as a little run through of what the differences are there.
Great, thanks. So as we jump into that process, how you would remake a chart like this, all the different considerations you might want during this process, we're trying to figure out how to tell a story using your data visualization. And the start of that is figuring out what the goal is. If you narrow down your goal and figure out what the purpose is, that's going to carry you through decision-making the whole process through. So every step of the ways, you're choosing your colors, the way you have your chart framed, what kind of data you want to use. This is going to be hugely important. So that might be considering what's included in your data set and how to group things, but really the goal is also based off of your audience. So those are just the first two big things you want to think about. Who's your audience and what do you want them to do or take away from your visualization? What argument, what story are you trying to tell? And here we just put up an example of two different charts. Again, this is the same data shown twice. On the left, this is an example from the Wall Street Journal. This shows infection rates for polio over time. And then there's a vertical line there that shows when the vaccine was implemented and then how drastically cases dropped after that. So it's trying to tell that story. I think it does it pretty effectively, but it really relies on color. It shows every state individually, and it is kind of busy to look at. And on the right, this is a redesign by Dr. Randall Olson, who just used the same data, but this is a simpler, cleaner version. All of the states are combined into this one line. And it shows just a different side of the same data. So two different ways to interpret it, two different ways to tell a very similar story. You can even imagine versions of this chart on the right where maybe it's focused on one specific state or on one population that might be relevant to whatever the story or argument is. So this is just to show there's multiple ways to show different elements of the data set, different ways to show the data itself. So you need to choose what your goal is so that you can make those decisions in a way that's best for you. Next slide, please. So that leads to focusing your data. You don't have to show everything in every chart. And that's one of the first things we wanted to emphasize. There's a lot that goes into that decision. What data do you want to show that's going to work well with your story? So it's really tempting to want to represent all of the data, all in one chart, so the viewer has every possible piece of information. And that's a good sentiment, but it might not be the most effective way to tell the story from the data. So if you declutter your graph and really show the most relevant parts of the data, the most important parts, you can create a more effective and easily interpreted graph. So for example, like before, if we're really only interested in undergraduates, we don't need to show faculty and staff, community members, graduate students. We can really just have a graph that shows the undergraduate students. Now, I understand that this sounds kind of like obscuring your data, hiding the parts that you don't want people to see. And that's a real concern and something that we need to keep in mind. Make your decisions in a way that isn't hiding data. It's just focusing the information. That's that second bullet point. You want to be zooming in on one part instead of erasing parts of your data. So don't just show undergraduates who study sciences because they attend a lot of workshops and you think it's going to make your numbers look good. Instead, choose a population, a group that's well-defined within the data. And then finally, providing your full data set allows people to take the same steps as you and follow your decision-making in a way that doesn't make them look at all the data at once unless they choose to, and want to go more in depth with things, you can give a focus chart, but also provide anonymized, if relevant, all of the data that's relevant here. Next slide. So here we have the first step of our remake. So we started with all those different colors. A lot of you pointed this out in the chat, which is great. A lot of different colors, all 4 of the populations that were measured in this data collection. And on the right, we have the updated version. It only shows undergraduates. It's already easier to compare those bars because you're not trying to gauge how tall different versions of the stack are and where they figure with each other. One population and one chart, because this is the only population that we decided was relevant for the story we're telling. Next slide. So now that we know what sort of data we want to use, and I realize we selected a chart already because we wanted to give some examples before this, is selecting an appropriate chart type. How do you want to represent that data graphically? There are tons of different types of charts and graphs out there. So just make sure you're thinking carefully about which one's going to show your data best. And there's lots of correct answers for this. So there's not going to be one single chart type that is better than all the others. There's a good chance you'll find several that will work, and you just need to figure out what's going to be best for this situation. And that leads to 2 main considerations. One, what type of data do you have? So categories, numerical data, text data, a mix of those things. And what type of chart is going to show off all that data best? And then what's the function of the chart? What are you trying to tell? So that could be comparing 2 things, which is what we're doing with that bar chart. We're comparing different workshop attendance. That could be a relationship between 2 different factors, or maybe a trend or a change over time. So you're looking at how things are different, looking at sort of a timeline of whatever you have collected. So there's different chart types that will work differently for those different factors, the type of data and the function of the chart. We just have a couple examples and then some resources for choosing charts. If you could go to the next slide. So first is a bar chart. Yeah, this will look familiar because this is the chart type that we chose today for our sample. And it's really good for comparing values across categories. So we had categories in those workshop titles, and we wanted to compare attendance numbers. So this one worked really well. And it also works well for numerical data, there's a lot of chart types that work well for numerical data, but there's also some that work well for textual data and other versions of that. In this case, this is what we went with. Next slide is another example. This is a line chart. Line graphs work well, again, for numerical data, but pretty well for changes over time. It doesn't have to be over time, but typically you see that timeline on the bottom, and this one it's years, and then you're counting something and maybe comparing several different versions of the same thing. Next slide. This one is a scatter plot. So again, just another example of a chart type that would work well for comparing things that may or may not have a correlative relationship. So here we can see there's a negative correlation because there is a trend line. You can also see every individual data point. So that's a real benefit of a scatter plot, is that you can see every data point where it falls. You can compare those. You're seeing a lot of data. You can also give a summary here with the plot line. Next slide. And that's just a couple of chart types. That's definitely not all of them. We wanted to show this as a draft sketch of our sample data in a few different formats, because you might start with one thing and change your mind later. It's an iterative process. So there's a couple versions here. There's some grouped bar charts at the top, grouped by workshop, or maybe instead grouped by population, maybe a pie graph, maybe a heat map. All of these things could work. And then you make a decision based on what you think is going to represent your data best. And then halfway through, maybe you've learned more, maybe you figured out some of the other elements you want to include, and you change your mind and want to go back to a different chart type. All of these decisions and the process are, they're going to change, and they're going to continue to update as you learn more and you figure out more about how you want to tell the story. Finally, this is a good example to say you don't have to start with a fancy tool or with software that takes a while to learn. I know that the software if that's what you choose to use, can be really intimidating as a place to start. So really you can just start pencil and paper, some colored pencils, figure out what you want to do, where you want to take this, and then work your way into the software. Next slide. Here we just have a couple of resources for selecting a chart type. And Natalia, I think you have one of these pulled up, and I'll just describe it while you're working on that. These are both resources for listing out tons of different chart types. There are different ways to sort. You can do it by function or by list. You can just go in and explore different versions of the same things. It's kind of like a giant dictionary for data visualizations. So if you have something like a hierarchy that you want to compare by, you can click on that and just see a couple of different, sometimes you get ads, but a couple of different visualizations that might work for that chart type. So this is fun to explore. I've definitely just clicked around and found some new types of visualizations that I hadn't heard of before. But it's also good for narrowing down what's going to work best for your data. And that's one. There's a second one on there too. Both of them are free, though those websites are. But because they're free, sometimes you might get advertisements on the web pages. And now I think the next section is color, which Natalia is going to talk about.
Thanks, Claire. And Libby, I do see your question about how do the options here compare to what's in Excel or PowerPoint. So I will say one thing that's really nice before I jump into color is if you use the data viz catalog in particular, sorry about that. There's sort of a section here that has a tools to generate. And so you might see examples of where you can create it. You'd be surprised. There are a number that like you can do on Excel. I'm not as familiar with sort of PowerPoint visualizations, so I'm not sure, but I think it's always worth sort of taking a look because you'd be surprised at what you can create with those. But great question. So jumping back into color. So this happens to be one of my favorite subjects. So it's a really important element to consider when you're visualizing your data. And there are some big questions to consider. When do we use color? How do we even choose colors? And how many colors do we actually need? So I'm going to go over a couple of some of the main principles and practices to get us started. We included a number of resources at the end. So if this is an area of interest that you're curious about, we've included more. But to get us started, and this is why when we did that the survey, the poll, I actually thought it was kind of funny and mentioned it. This is a really good example of what typically a number of tools that we may use will automatically generate for us when we're creating particularly bar charts. And so what's interesting here is you're looking at each category has its own color.
Bye, Panda.
Okay, so each one has its own color. And so oftentimes, while this graph is really aesthetically pleasing, at least to me, we'll notice that the color isn't actually being used to convey any information. And the reason the way you can sort of realize that is if you look at this first chart on the left and look at this middle chart, you'll see that they're conveying the exact same information. You're not getting any extra information through that color that you're not getting in the one chart that's all gray, right? So bar graphs, because we're using height of the bars to really sort of denote how much of a category there is, we're already sort of getting that information through the height. And so the issue here really is oftentimes we may end up using color and then kind of not realize later on that color is a tool and a resource that we can use to potentially sort of aid in creating more nuanced stories, right? And so if you look at the middle chart, which is a perfectly fine chart, oftentimes how bar graphs sort of look, but compare it to the one on the right, you'll notice that there's a red bar that's highlighted. And so really what's happening here is your eye generally is being drawn into that bar, and it's because of the color, right? And so if you have a story where you want to highlight something in particular, and maybe it's not the tallest bar, because oftentimes we'll look at the tallest and the lowest, right? But if you're interested in sort of highlighting something, so 1995 is particularly of interest in this year, in this graph, and that's being used by sort of really selectively using red. Another thing I will point out, and it's not visualized here, but if, for instance, 1992 was also in red, sort of similar to 1995, we would inherently sort of understand that there's sort of a connection there, right? There's a relationship to those 2 years, and maybe we have to look closer at that data, but we can tell from pretty far away that there is some sort of connection there, and that's really helpful when you're telling a story. So in this slide, we're sort of introducing now this idea of like, well, when you do need to use color, how do we choose colors? So whereas in the previous slide, we saw single bar charts where you don't necessarily need to use color to differentiate categories. In this one, in this Gallup poll from 2007, we are using a grouped bar chart, right? So there are different countries that are being grouped together by color. So we do require to use color. And there we have to ask sort of the question of how do we then select those colors? So you're gonna notice that in that chart, their use of green is sort of green is being used, right? And so there's sort of a scale that we're noticing. The US starts with sort of this darker green, and then it kind of goes into lighter greens through the countries, right? And so what's interesting here is I would assume that the author may have potentially been interested in offering some thematic color scheme, right? So it's talking about environmental practices in these various countries. And so perhaps the author created this with the thought of offering some cultural associations, right? Which is a really great use of color as well. When we're creating data visualizations, we may often rely on sort of understood associations. So if you look at temperature maps, a lot of times you may notice we often use sort of cooler blues to signify cold or snow. And then oftentimes when we're getting warmer, we may use colors like orange or red that are typically considered warmer colors, right? And so those are great things to sort of consider and think about. We may also have branding standards that we need to adhere to. So those are important to consider. But what's happening here with the greens is we're actually, because the colors are sort of set up in a scale, what's called a sequential scale, it's sort of creating this inadvertent messaging that there is some sort of inherent order with countries, right? And so like we know there is no scale of Russia to India, right? So it doesn't really make sense. And it kind of is a misleading, a little bit of a confusing graph to interpret. When we look over at the right, we'll notice this is a better use of color for this type of graph because all the colors are completely different colors. The US is represented by green, China is purple, Russia is sort of an orange, Japan is yellow, India blue. So there is no sort of relationship between these colors, which makes more sense, right? These are different separate categories. So be aware of that when you're working with different colors. In this example, we are going to use a sequential scale, right? And for a lot of us, we may be most familiar with a sequential scale with maps. And so on the left side, you're going to notice this is some census data and it's using a scale from sort of a very light orange to a much more saturated, darker orange. And so it's visualizing the total population in Raleigh, those who are under the age of 18. And so you're going to sort of see that as in the areas where it's lighter, it's a smaller percentage of a population that's under the age of 18, whereas when we see, oh, sorry, opposite. Color shades of the, sorry, I saw a question. Color have been used to account for people who are colorblind. Could shades of the same? Yes, Candace, and we're actually going to cover that in a second. So great question. So yeah, so this is a good use of the sequential color scale, and we often are accustomed to seeing it in maps. And then I wanted to point out on the right side, we have another example, which is from the Pew Research Center, and it's looking at sort of social media usage across these different platforms. And one thing that I think is really interesting to highlight here is oftentimes we do a lot of surveys and we're collecting survey data from our community, and a really helpful way to showcase what's called Likert scale questions. So the questions where we're asking people to rate something in a scale can often be represented with stacked bar charts like this. And so you can use color to keep that scale clear and obvious and sort of see the connections. And so we wanted to showcase that. Another thing I should point out about both of these is with a sequential color scale, you'll notice usually we read lighter as meaning having a smaller quantity. And then as the scale gets darker or more saturated or brighter, we often interpret that as having a higher quantity, right? So you'll see in the stacked bar chart, the navy is several times a day, and then it gets lighter as you get to like less frequent days. So just be aware of that as you're creating sequential color scales. And Candace, I think this might address your question. So when we're thinking about accessibility, which is really important, we want to make sure to think about some colors that are particularly problematic. So red and green are especially challenging and a color combo to avoid in general. But we've listed a few more that you should generally sort of avoid. And if you notice the palette on the left, you'll see the different examples of how different types of color blindness will perceive those colors. And I think one thing, Candace, that I believe, if I'm understanding your question correctly, sort of it alludes to this monochromatic palettes. We often, if you use contrast and sort of rely on that, so using the same color potentially, or even using different colors, but shifting, sort of having one that's light, one that's dark, that can help with sort of the understanding or interpretation. So for instance, if in this graph, that first red were a lot lighter and the last green were maybe a little darker, while you wouldn't be able to interpret the actual color, you would be able to tell that they're different lightness and darkness values. And so you can tell they're different. So that's a good way to approach that as well. And we've included Coblis is a color blindness simulator. That's a tool we have recommended in the past. There are also different plugins that you can use. So for example, I can even sort of show, I have a plugin currently, it's called Spectrum. And if I click on it, I can actually sort of test all my slides, which I use pretty frequently, just to test things out. So there are a number of tools, and we've included a few of them in the end of the slides. And then just a couple more things about color. So we kind of talked about this using contrast, both for accessibility purposes, Also thinking about if your presentation or if your visualization may happen to end up getting printed. Oftentimes things get printed black and white. Perhaps someone forwards your presentation to someone else. Just be wary of how it might be presented. And so you'll notice, here's an example of when perhaps the different colors are in the same value or the same brightness or darkness spectrum. Here is a better example of how someone accounts for that. So plans ahead. And so when it does get printed, it looks it looks easier to decipher. And lastly, I just wanted to show two resources. So Color Brewer is oftentimes used more for maps. We do like it, and it can be used for things other than maps. And so here you would put in sort of the number of categories you have, whether you have a sequential or qualitative, that's when you want different colors. And you get a couple of color schemes you can choose. And you can sort of use some of these settings to help you figure out if they're colorblind safe, if they're print friendly, and etc. And you can use these codes here. So Color Brew is a pretty user-friendly one, pretty quick. It has a limited palette, I will say. Coolers, which Claire also shared, is a pretty fun one. It's it gets a little, it has a lot of options. So you can kind of play around with it a little bit more and generate palettes from images. But so I did just want to show it rather quickly, and you can kind of play around and sort of change your shades. So it's a nice tool to maybe try. And then lastly, just to go back to our remake, our redesign. So in this redesign, when we thought about color, we had already sort of reduced colors because we had selected one category. And so in this scenario, Claire and I were reviewing the data and noticed in particular sort of an anomaly in our workshop titles. So we noticed that there was a high attendance rate for our dissertation prep session with undergrads, which for us, when we were looking at it, it was very interesting given that this was a workshop that was geared for graduate students. And so we then sort of make a decision to highlight it so that our team can then review it and really pay attention to it and sort of inquire why that might be. And so now we're going to go ahead and move into type and text.
So, like Natalia said, type and text, we're just going to talk about all of the different ways to include words and text in your data visualizations, which can be really important for describing things and making it easy to navigate. Next slide. So first, our type systems, because too much type or text can be really overwhelming on a chart. But if you use some kind of a type system, which just means creating different levels and types of annotation on your visualization, it can make it easier to read and interpret. So to create those different levels, you could do something like bold text or unbold it, increase the font size by really just 2 points. You don't need to be too drastic with that. Or color, and again, that's using high contrast colors or in contrasting your background color to make sure they're still readable, even if you change the color. So this example in the background has 4 levels. You can see there is a title, which is bold. It's easy to read. There's a subtitle right underneath it. So new cases per day is the title, and Raleigh, North Carolina is that subtitle. Then there's slightly lighter text that mark the axes at the bottom, all of the months, and then on the side, those case numbers. And then the 4th type, and this is my favorite type of text on a visualization, is a little call out. So you can see that it will show a little point to say this is a 7-day average, and then another point up to the right that says new cases. And these are just extra call outs that are trying to make this graph as easy to interpret as possible. They're fairly small, still legible, and of course that would depend on the size of the chart, but trying to make sure that every element is explained so that a viewer can look at this, read just a few things, and be able to interpret the data that's shown. The last thing about this, it's important to keep that type system really consistent across your visualization or visualizations if you're doing more than one, so that a reader knows how important a piece of information is and can navigate that visualization, that layout really easily because you've kept it consistent across the entire thing. Next slide. So just again on those notations, those annotations, this is another example to show not how to navigate the chart, but a specific data point. This is a chart about CO2 emissions. And for whatever reason, the chart creator wanted to call out the 50th percentile for coal on that top line. So they added a label right above it. It draws your eye right to that data point and you know exactly what it's supposed to be, the 50th percentile, and you can look and tell that it's for the line for coal. Next slide. And finally, for type and text, here are a few quick tips for using that type and text. The top here is to make sure to keep your text left aligned. Centering or right aligning your text can make it more difficult to read. So in our do column, left align your text. Underneath that, giving your text room to breathe, making sure there is space around it will also make it easier to read. So in our don't column, either it doesn't have enough space around it or it doesn't line up with some kind of a box or container. So again, keeping some space around your text. And finally, keeping your type horizontal. So if it is vertical or slanted for English text, that's going to be difficult. You're going to kind of turn your head and try and see and read things. So if it's horizontal, it'll be a lot easier for people to access. Next slide, please. And here we have our text remake. So we did a couple things in this step to make our chart a little better. First thing, the one that's most noticeable is that we rotated the chart 90 degrees here. So instead of a vertical bar chart, it is a horizontal bar chart. That means that all of the titles of our workshops are now horizontal, makes them a lot easier to read on the side, and none of them get cut off because there isn't enough space. We also added labels for both of the axes, so it's easy to tell what we're measuring, number of attendees, and the name of the workshops. And again, using that text system, we created a title that's just a little bit larger and more prominent that is now renamed much more descriptively for our revised data undergraduate student workshop attendance. So hopefully this makes it easier to interpret, easier to read and work with. All right, so that is the last of our revisions, the last of our sections. So here we have a final version. We did make one or two more changes. It just didn't fit into our other groups, so we wanted to mention them here in the last step. On the left, you see that's the last version we talked about. On the right, we have our final version. So those two changes, one, we took out the 3D option. So on the left, the old version, the bars are made to look more like three-dimensional boxes. It's really just not necessary, and it makes it more difficult to read this flat version. It's a lot easier to compare the bars, easier to read. And finally, we sorted the data so that the most highly attended workshops are at the top and the lowest are at the bottom. So again, if we're trying to find out rankings at the very beginning when we took that poll, it takes you a couple of seconds to compare across the groups and then figure out which ones were first, second, and third, figure that out. If they're already in order, then you can interpret that in just seconds. So now that a little more thought and effort has gone into the design of the chart, it's going to be easier for us to use it to tell that story. So like Natalia already mentioned, if you were presenting this chart to your department, your coworkers, or making an argument to your department head about the next workshop you should plan, you could give this chart. It's easy to tell what the most highly attended workshops are for undergraduates. And you can point to that second one that's already highlighted using color and that contrasting, I've lost the word, contrasting color and value. And you can say here, the second most highly attended workshop is for undergraduates is dissertation prep, making figures. Dissertation prep isn't usually meant for undergraduates because they don't usually write dissertations, but they're still attending a workshop because they must want to learn how to make figures. So maybe our next workshop, the next one we plan and implement, should be a workshop meant for beginners and people taking intro classes on how to make figures and charts and graphs. This chart is really going to aid that argument. It's going to work with it and just, and hopefully in your data storytelling, you're using the data and the charts you create just to strengthen what you're already saying. So you don't want to spend all of your time telling people how to interpret the chart or the graph. You shouldn't have to, stand next to it and say, well, first you should look for the green color because green is for undergraduates. And then we're going to compare. And if you look 3 bars to the left and to the right, then you can find the bar. And that's the one I'm talking about. Hopefully instead you could put this up and say, look, we've done all the work for you. Easy to interpret and to say, look, this one's highly attended, but this wasn't our intended audience. So maybe we should make something that's meant just for them. All right, and that's the end of our presentation. We talked about a lot of different elements there. We have some resources here. These are all free websites. We didn't include any paid tools on the list. There's lots of tools that you could use to create your visualizations. But today we wanted to focus more on the design elements that would help you tell that story. And you can choose the tool that's going to work best for you. Though we're happy to talk a little bit more about that if need be. So Natalia and Devin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm happy to take questions and hear more about what you're interested in for the rest of this time.
Thank you both so much. Folks, if we have questions, submit them in the chat. We'll take a few minutes as people are thinking of them. And I think in particular, what I really appreciate about your presentation is the fact that these elements are really the starting point and the software just allows you to do something, whether it's Excel or Tableau. That's more of like an endpoint that you'll learn the features of that tool, figure out how to navigate it. But like these are kind of the core things to start off with. So thank you so much for that.
Definitely. We know that every institution, every person is going to have access to different software, might prefer different software or not want to use software at all and just draw it on a giant piece of graph paper. All of those work. So whatever end result, like you said, works for you is great. We're just trying to think about hopefully any method that you choose will let you make some of these choices and be conscious about that.
And as folks are heading out, I just want to include a link for our collaborative literacy learning series. So this is the second of 6 webinars in the series this month. Next week, we'll be covering digital literacy, and the week after, we'll be covering early childhood literacy. So if you're interested in what's coming up, feel free to take a look and register. All right, well, if we have no questions at the moment, Claire and Natalia, is it okay if I include your contact info in the email in case people want to reach out to you?
Yes, that's okay.
Great.
Well, thank you, everyone.
All right, well, we will be switching over to our breakout rooms. So if you want to stick around for that, just stay on the Zoom meeting and we'll split up into 2 breakout rooms. Claire and Natalia, you're welcome to stick around.